When we pay any attention to anything political, whether it be the debates, articles, or social media, there are a lot of common themes that are being discussed. Climate change, abortion, immigration, etc. These are the most divisive topics in our current world and will continue to be more controversial as the years go by. While they are important, it seems as though the most important topic that everybody agrees on, and perhaps the only area where we see some level of bipartisanship, is completely ignored: the economy. Everybody wants the economy to do well. When we turn on our TVs, it is quite rare to hear about the accumulation of debt. When we watch the debates, we haven't heard any moderator ask a candidate, what are you going to do about the rise of inflation, housing prices being unaffordable, the rise of homelessness? While climate change is important, it is difficult to care when you can't afford groceries and you have mouths to feed. On September 10th, 2024, the U.S. national debt is $35 trillion, while the GDP is $28 trillion, which concludes that the debt makes up of 125% of the U.S. GDP. The UK's debt makes up of 85% of the nation's GDP, and Japan's makes up 253%, and the number keeps on growing. To maintain stability, nations will print money to create inflation. Now, inflation is detrimental if you are of the poor, middle class, and even the rich. But if you are a part of the powerful elite, inflation is credible. The rise of inflation increases the value of assets such as stocks and real estate, but most importantly, increases the likelihood to pay off debt, which is what the U.S. needs for the GDP to catch up with the debt. Inflation, debt doesn't rise, but the price of currency does. Creating inflation results in currency being devalued, which is a common strategy of stabilizing the economy. If I sell a product that costs $5 to a Mexican establishment, and let's say they pay 100 pesos for it, since $5 is equal to 100 pesos, that is quite expensive for a $5 product. Therefore, the Mexican establishment will look elsewhere for a more affordable price. But if I devalue my currency, it decreases the likelihood of that establishment purchasing my products. However, government debt isn't as detrimental as the debt that the citizens carry. For example, there is a worldwide housing crisis, and that is affecting each citizen of every country. As of the first quarter, mortgage debt accounted for 70% of American consumer debt, totaling $12.4 trillion. The rise in housing prices is also affecting prices in other areas of consumer goods. Because to make up for the price of rent, businesses, whether it be retail, supermarkets, or restaurants, have to raise prices significantly to pay the cost of rent or mortgage. Obviously, the sanctions against Russia have played a significant role since the invasion of Ukraine in the overall cost of consumer goods. Nonetheless, the cost of rent has contributed to the overall rise in cost of consumer goods. Furthermore, the inability of many Americans to afford housing is closely linked to student loan debt. Student loan debt is the second largest form of debt, totaling $1.75 trillion. With such a significant portion of the population burdened by student loan debts, many young people are unable to save enough money for home purchases, pushing them into the rental market. The increased demand for rental properties has driven up rental prices, exacerbating the housing crisis. But here's where it gets weird. The same companies that have a hand in giving all these large student loans now also own 50% of all rental units in America.
In 2001, only about 18% of rental units were owned by corporations. Today, that's about 50%.
So to recap, the companies that are giving out these overpriced mortgages also give out overpriced student loans. A person that takes out student loans is now in a large accumulation of debt that his current job can't pay off. Because of this, he can't pay for a house, so he tries to get a mortgage, but the mortgage is too expensive, and with his debt, there's no way he's paying that, so he rents a place instead. Because there's so many like him, the rental prices are increased significantly, so now he lives in a rental unit, paying overpriced rent to the same company that he's also paying student loans to, which as a result can't live in a house because that same company's mortgages are way too high. That is a problem that many Americans have found themselves in. But this wasn't always the case. The citizens were never in this amount of debt. There was a point in time where students typically had to get a summer job to pay the cost of a university. This was realistic as the universities were affordable. So what happened? Student loans. Once student loans were approved, the cost of universities skyrocketed, since technically anybody can afford it. That would conclude that to prevent student loan debt from accumulating, all one has to do is stop giving out student loans. Thus, the universities have no choice but to lower their prices to be more affordable. The same method could be used for the housing market. Since mortgages are permitted, the prices of houses have soared, which has led to the housing crisis and the highest debt in the United States. If mortgages were outlawed, the owners of these houses would have no choice but to lower prices to be more affordable. So if these are potential solutions, how come it isn't being discussed? As a matter of fact, why aren't these issues being talked at a larger extent than it should be? Well, to answer both questions, the most logical explanation is that these solutions affect the powers that be, such as the banks, conglomerates, and so forth. A method that has been used by the mafia was to give out loans that they know their clients won't be able to pay back. The reason being is that they will forever be in debt to them, and from there they could take their assets as collateral. The United States does this to other poor countries as well, and therefore we are able to occupy land, natural resources, or anything of value. So when you see amounts of money being given out to a poor country such as Ukraine, remember, there is no such thing as a free handout. Well, this is no different than what the banks do to civilians, except the biggest difference is that the money that is being loaned is created out of thin air. It doesn't exist. So the banks are giving out loans that are too big, thus trapping people to paying the bank back that the bank never lost in the first place. And of course, with inflation, the interest rates will rise along with it. If a new law was passed that forbade banks from giving out student loans and mortgages, the housing market would most likely crash, which is bad for the banks but great for citizens. Finally, houses are more affordable and rental units are affordable. University is affordable, and the majority of the young adults are not in debt. The most common answer to solving debt problems in the United States is for the government to pay for it. This may seem like a nice idea, but it goes against the benefits capitalism brings to the United States. Many citizens will not want to pay the government so others can benefit. This, to many Americans, can lead to socialism, which is a trail they do not want to go down, which, if I'm being honest, can understand and actually agree with. Thus, this potential solution can satisfy both parties. Prices are cheaper for everybody, and the American citizens won't have to pay for it. And if we really want to push the envelope, goods and services like retail, restaurants, and what have you, will be cheaper as well, since they don't have to make up for commercial mortgage or rent. Of course, loans or businesses, including commercial mortgages, should be protected, but for the average working citizen, not only are they not beneficial, but actually a trap. All in all, it is clear to see that the only loser from this idea is the banks and the companies who are associated with them. 65% of banks' revenue comes from interest rates, majority of which are from mortgages and student loans. So if a law has passed that prevented banks from giving out these loans, then they would also lose a lot of money. Needless to say, they do not want this to ever happen. This is why the economy gets the least amount of time in debates. This is why the media doesn't spend as much time covering the economy. Instead, they cover stories to distract you from the economy. Out of all the people, a comedian explained it the best. This is Dave Smith on the Valuetainment Network.
And if you go look at this was a concerted effort from the top. You can go look. There are these nexus charts where you can map out words in major publications. I'm not talking about mom and pop news outlets. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, like the big dogs. Go track how many times the word racism was mentioned. And around 2012, it shoots up.
Yep.
Social justice shoots up. Transgenderism shoots up. White privilege shoots up. This was forced on the American people. Why are we having these conversations now? No, the people did not wake up one day and decide, we want to have a national conversation about chicks with dicks. That didn't happen. This wasn't an organic movement. It was all of the most powerful people decided this is what we're going to talk about. And why was that? Because it's the perfect, look, when you're failing on policy, you pivot to a culture war.
Yep.
You pit people against each other, so they're fighting each other.
Yep.
We had in this country, we had an Occupy Wall Street movement where leftists were standing outside of big banks screaming, we are the 99%. Right-wingers had a populist movement called the Tea Party, where they were outraged about the bailouts of big banks, unsustainable debt, government spending. They don't like that. That's not what the powers that be like. You're getting too close. Look, they like you fighting about issues like abortion. Now, I'm not saying abortion isn't a very important issue. It's a very important issue. But us fighting about that issue doesn't scare anyone at the Federal Reserve. It doesn't scare anyone in the CIA. They don't care if you fight about that issue. They love you fighting over transgender bathrooms.
Yep.
He hasn't been the only one that has noticed this method. Distraction. It is clear that the powers that be have decided what is not only appropriate to protest about, but what they encourage to protest about and what they absolutely discourage. For example, in 2020, Black Lives Matter or BLM riots resulted in the deaths of 25 people and over $2 billion worth of damages. What was the government's response? They told the police to stand down. Every politician was kneeling for the group. The media encouraged the rioters, and when citizens tried to protect themselves and small businesses from looters, they were arrested. Now, recently, Palestine protests took place in universities across America. Nobody was killed or harmed. There were very little damages, if any, and the protest wasn't about martyring a repeat criminal. It was to stop the genocide of the Palestinians. What was the government response? There were more arrests in the first 2 weeks than the entire Hong Kong protests. Politicians all condemn it and label them as Hamas supporters. Nancy Pelosi even went as far as stating that the protesters were Putin agents. The powers that be drew the line in the sand. Protests about race, trans issues, LGBT, or any sort of social justice, not only will they not condemn you, they will encourage you to protest. Protests of war, the banks, Israel, you will be put in jail with no sympathy. So for the 2 or 3 people who are actually going to watch this video, just remember the next time you see the media encourage division of any kind, instead of choosing a side, focus on what they are trying to hide instead.